We won't waste any more time. We'll be talking that people can read the program, so we're going to let you get started.
Thank you so much. My gratitude goes to Dr. Grayboy, not only for organizing this event, but also for allowing some space for somebody from Europe and from somebody from the thresholds of Indigenous studies. Certainly, I'm not a Native American expert, which a lot of people in Europe claim to be, especially in German-speaking countries, as you might know. And there is a major paradigm shift in academia for post-colonial studies and those studies that we somewhat touched upon with regards to George's presentation. And I just like to mention some of the connections to some of the previous presentations, in particular Alicia's one on heritage ownership and how unofficial heritage might be turned to official one, which is part of the topic that I'm discussing, Dr. Baptist's cognitive imperialism, and I do discuss that not necessarily with the same term, but I mean the same. And decision making is really a central part of what I have investigated and the different power discourses. God bless you. Charlotte has mentioned historical traumas, and I do deal with a number of traumas that people of blended heritage have inherited. And last but not least, George's mention of Indianism and Indigenism and how it is reflected and presented and challenged through fiction and visual arts and movies. So what I actually explore is the threshold of Indigenous and Euro-American paradigms and what happens when these paradigms clash in the same person, in that particular person's heritage. More generally speaking, there is, for instance, a German father and a Pueblo, Laguna Pueblo mother on the sides, and what Paula Van Hope has called the conflicting blood for that person has seemed to be a stigma for long years, decades, and even hundreds of years. And I believe there is a paradigm shift and a turn for a different understanding of mixed heritage as of the 1990s and millennium. So I will just tell you a little bit more about that, how it is reflected in literature and visual art. My goal is partly making Native American and Indigenous cultures of the Western Canada visible in Hungary. And George is here as also a participant of the American Indian Workshop. I know it's a shitty name to call any kind of an organization, but still this is 44 years of scholars who meet every year to make Indigenous culture visible in Europe, and more recently in Budapest. I organized that conference with a lot of people, and there was also an exhibition at the Museum of Ethnography with Marks and Spencer, Marla Edison, and some of these big names from the Southwest that you might know, and hope if you don't listen. For the postdoctoral research that I have had, it focused on cognitive processes related to identity negotiation, multiple engagements, voice raising, and reconciling with blended heritage. And I collaborated with more cultural psychology experts as well as visual artists for that matter. So my final goal with this presentation and with your feedbacks and just discussions that we have had over the last 2 days almost is to expand the scope of Indigenous studies, Native American studies, and whatever academia does for making visible Indigenous culture. So let me start with this little quotation from Louisa Vance. I have learned to inhabit a hybrid, unpapered, Cherokee, Welsh, Irish, Cajun mixed space in between. I conceive of myself today not as Indian, but as a mixed blood, a person of complex roots and histories, and the product of liminal space, the result of union between desperate individuals on the edges of dispossessed cultures and the marginalized crowd of invaders. The descendants of mixed blood sharecroppers possessed of two continents. This is one of my favorite pictures by one of the Southwestern key artists in photo art. And before going into detail, Ross doesn't like read-offs, but if you allow 2 pages to share, I think that would give you guys a little more understanding of why I'm doing this whole thing and what I want to achieve with my students and conferences and all these engagements. What does being born multiracial imply? How can one cope with the prejudice surrounding blended ethnocultural heritage? How can literature contribute to the self-understanding of millions of complex ancestry in North America, who by population statistics are becoming the majority, the new normal? What is the role and responsibility of those who formulate public opinion on mixed race? How can parents and children cope with and relate to the problem of multiracial family relations? What kind of examples can literary texts offer for identity reformulation for a more balanced, content, and socially effective personality? How can we approach those who have developed psychological and social issues due to the negative experiences of their childhoods and early adult lives? How can Native America, critical indigenous and mixed race studies expand the scope of American studies? And last but not least, how can a European reader of Southwestern literature contribute to the understanding of blended heritage existence, the related social complexities and literature? My interest in these questions emerged from 2 directions. Earlier, I had explored the concept of the white man's Indian, the common practice of going native. Following the publication of Going Indian, Cultural Appropriation in recent North American literature, I realized that besides the Anglo-American Canadians who have encountered indigenous culture and decided to develop a supposed tribal identity component of any reason, for any reason, there is a growing number of people who have indigenous ancestry on the one side of the family and who also struggle with defining themselves, with social acceptance and visions of who they are. The second stimulus emerged during my Fulbright mission in New Mexico, where cultural, racial, and ethnic mixing is common, and the personal examples of identity confusion and positive coping strategies have always been exciting to observe and then thought-provoking to read about in Southwestern literature. I have met visual artists of blended heritage who mostly identify themselves as Native American and have studied related areas of psychology, sociology, philosophy, and postcolonial studies. I started to realize that the down runners in Scotland the way to Rainy Mountains, on the so-called blood trails, or as mentioned in Mixed Blood Messages, basically reenact the ceremony that Circle's novel of the same time centers around, the ancient pattern of recognizing and revitalizing one's indigenous roots, while I also had to understand that this special learning process and complex social adjustment entail multiple impacts and often prove not doable for the majority of those contemporary mixed race individuals for whom indigeneity is not a real life connection, but just like for anyone else, a rather romantic idea that may result in rejection on both tribal and Anglo-American urban community sites. So, the way I connect to the topic of this conference, revitalization, I think is now pretty understandable, that the revitalization and reconnection is not an easy thing and at hand, and this refusal and rejection and doubts and concerns and suspicion at both sides, both in both cultures and communities, surround a number of these identity renegotiation procedures. But what I found really exciting is the way how the colonial paradigm is transferred and transcended, and how the binaries disappear and are kind of deflected, how fluidity and liminality is step by step accepted. And I also investigated the psychology reflected in literature, obviously, the psychology of, what kind of elements have impact on the particular individual's choices that that a person makes when highlighting any part of the identity that is available for that person. I'm also excited about is agency reclaimed the same way as it happens, for instance, when you, everybody else, all the presenters have discussed so far how you revitalize and language and through that perhaps gain agency over traditional culture. And also, I'm really excited to see how post-colonial nations and Canada and the US in particular perceive indigeneity as part of the blend. So what do you do with this whole thing that there are people who are mixed blood considering themselves Native American, and then what do you do with the other half, and how do you relate to them? Okay, for the academic context, obviously you can see that traditional American studies and Canadian studies cannot capture these complexities. So we have to go for cross-cultural psychology, for regionalism studies, for mixed race studies, for critical indigenous studies. And the more we integrate into the research, the better I believe, because a single focus, single approach, single perspective doesn't seem to work, at least not for me in these endeavors. And I also call for a revision of what Europeans and what European higher education and academia believes about the goal and the mission and the responsibility of discussing anything related to indigeneity in North America. At this previous conference, I simply asked colleagues to think about why we do what we do. And that's such a different question if you compare 40 years ago at the time of the communist regimes when people had this romanticized images of the Indian and what it meant. And there is a whole kind of library literature on that I discussed in the previous group. For the paradigm shift, I don't go into detail on each and every item. I just want you to see that during the 1980s, for a number of reasons, social changes stimulated this shift that I argue for, that you can see in visual arts and literature. As for portraits, self-portraits in visual arts and autobiographies in literature, because both, like all these genders, seem to reflect up until the 80s, you have this faces and portraits of white and red, cowboy and Indian. And this kind of division of the body is pretty much there in these paintings and photos and other pieces of visual arts. And the same applies to literature, that up until the 80s there is this kind of constant struggle and stigma, confusion about I'm not good enough, I'm not Indian enough, I'm not white enough, this kind of off and out thing. Whereas these days, if you talk to artists like Marla Ellison, for instance, who's our friend so I know her more, there is this kind of reflection of the face which is more homogeneous, more positive, doesn't struggle too much with who she is, but takes a good use of these knowledge archives from Native, Pueblo, and Euro-American ancestries. And this utilization of ancestral knowledge is there so much visible in her art, for instance, some of these paintings. For a short list, I guess most of the items that you see here, it might ring a bell to you, but a number of them are purely labeled as Native American writing, which is okay with me. It's just, I like my students to know that those authors also have this kind of blended heritage, and at some point they decided that they call themselves full-blooded Native American, and I don't want to get into that discussion because I'm not entitled. Who's full-blood and who is like always brought to misery. But the thing is that what I argue for is that those artists and authors that you see here from, especially Darcy McNichols down up to Joy Harjo, they utilize all these assets, these cultural assets in their writing, and there's a special sensibility for ethnic and ethno-racial identity formulation in their art and literature. So that's the only thing that I argue for, and nothing more, nothing less. Again, I'm sure that you know some of these writers from US Southwest and even from Canada. And more recently, for instance, what's the name of this guy? Some of them get into trouble of just claiming indigenous sites but not really having those, like tribal heritage. Not those ones that you can see here, but like 2 or 3 over the last 20 years turned out not to have, just only plain indigenous sites. So that's another kind of a big question, who and who is not indigenous writer. And here are some of the art pieces that I also include in the book, and you find flyers of this book on your table. So, for instance, Fitz Shoulder, he is an artist who had this half and half and divided images of the cowboy and Indian, the coyote face, where the coyote can shapeshift from in and out of the body, the red face or the white face. And for Marla and Diego Romero and Will Wilson, and even Robson Swenson, she also was a participant of the Budapest conference. This is not like, there is no centrality of the stigma or the division, more like an embracing of all components of heritage. Okay, so this is the focus of research, and I just pulled out the 2 books because I believe that you can see just an example of how European scholars attempt to reflect the diversity that we see in North American culture these days from going Indian stories to landed heritage stories, and there's so much written up, and still it's so frustrating. I don't know how you felt about it, but some of the conferences go back all the time to the same thing of Indianism and Carme and Cooper and the images, which is like, it's done. We don't want to have that more because it reinforces the same kind of stigmas that we want to get rid of, right? So, what the actual problems, related problems for the individuals are, and this is what comes out of fiction that I've read and discussed, is on the one hand similar to, like, some of these problems are similar to just Native American, Indigenous Canadian people and issues related to individual social psychology of being Indigenous. For instance, invisibility and proper ways of becoming visible and getting a voice, getting rid of the Indianness part of any kind of a colonial agenda. Also, close definitions of who people are. For mixed blood, it's just because they have been captured for hundreds of years as half-breed and kids of miscalculation and all the derogatory terminology. Obviously, they need more space to kind of figure out their identity. And what I personally find exciting is cognitive dissonance avoidance. Now, I have developed a whole chapter in the chart about it that I will just quickly show you. But the point is that I found in fiction, in literature, and secondary sources, a very direct correlation between a person's education, cultural exposure, intercultural exposure, living with a tribal community or not, being urban or just purely far distance from actual indigenous cultures. So several of the environmental factors, as well as the individual's own psyche and upbringing, have an impact on how an individual copes with cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is by birth there with that kid because, for instance, for Mala, German father, Pueblo mother, still they live on Laguna Pueblo, but for her she didn't face any problem of who she is up until going to school. That's where, people have their first questions about, hey, so what about your daddy, and how come he lives here in the Pueblo? So the cognitive dissonance factor kicks in when the child first faces questions about identity that was natural so far, or had been natural for the same person for a long while. And then how she or he copes with that depends on education, upbringing, stress tolerance, and a number of factors that we will see in a minute. I also deal with the consciousness, how conscious people are about identity making and performing and projecting, and how they cope with the difference between author-ascribed and ego-recognized identity. So when I know that identity questions in Canada mostly have been part of 1970s up to millennium quest for identity things, but even today, an expression of the gap, my new gap between how others feel about me, how I think you think of me, right? It makes a difference, especially as compared to who I consider myself to be. And today we heard some of the presentations touching upon discursive practices and discourse analysis required to give a context to all these investigations and to enable, for instance, students better understand the historical context of indigeneity in North America. So I know you can't see the details. I'm just giving you this as a first-hand look to the process that I tried to depict in literature. So that's all the literary protagonists presenting some kind of a change. And there is always a triggering element that you see in fiction that puts the character into motion about who he or she is and how he or she can cope with questions of his identity and what kind of factors are there. And what I thought I would share with you, because I'm talking about literature but not really kind of showing it to you, is firsthand, is an example. And that is Louis O'Banks's Sharpest Sight and Bone Games, two of his novels, because some of the factors that you saw in the previous chart are kind of reflected here. One is the so-called personal variables, individual background variables, such as upbringing and education. In that novel, you have Paul McCurtain as a divorced, allegedly white but chocolate Cherokee Irish college professor. And so, page 10, he says, what I know from books in school and those old TV movies is that Hallbreed can't be trusted. There's a killer, a betrayal, a greed. So he goes to powwows. This is, I think, pretty common that people try to reconnect with symbolic practices of indigeneity for good or bad. And then, maybe they participate in some of these practices and maybe they are happy with that or the community is happy with that, but that's a shaky procedure. But then there's another kind of an exposure to grandparents and relatives and how they react to, questions about the person's identity. Grandma does not speak. Speaking of languages, at that time, she refused to speak Indian at home. I think it's a protective act for the kid to assimilate into Anglo culture. At that time, this was, I think, pretty natural in some families, whereas the grandfather, obviously of white European origins, he's ashamed of marrying an Indian woman, which is also part from Darcy McNichols's The Surrounded. You can see how torn these families are and what about the difficulties for a child to be brought up in that really divided heritage. And then some of the other relatives, like Onatina and Uncle Luther, they seem to be getting closer spiritually to, like, kind of pushing the guy into posing questions and really starting to explore authentic indigeneity and possible ways to reconnect in a more kind of more mature way. So it's a learning process, and depending on the individual, they can be stuck up or they can move on and reconnect to somewhat to Native American culture. For some other features, like the conflict resolution between Old Torres Pride and Igbo-recognized identity, he says, I'm tangled, mixed, and interrelated. I'm half-breed like my father, actually. I'm 3/8 breed. So I guess that makes me 7/16 breed, almost a half-breed like my father. So it's almost ridiculous that people are kind of so much hooked up from their school days to the blood quantum misery. And then, basically what, on the other hand, some of the relatives show him is some kind of a more meaningful way to reconnect. For instance, the ceremony of returning bones and the ceremony of reconnecting in a spiritual way to his family. So, just to wrap up on Bone Games, his other exciting novel, we mentioned yesterday at this table of the Bone Games and collecting bones and all this kind of procedure. So here the process variables are, for instance, is that he tries to build a new life and come to terms with his heritage, but he's not able to on his own. So a college professor with very high education, what comes is there is a young Indian guy, native guy on campus, Alex Jazzy, who actually very very aggressive way challenges him and that's the triggering impact in his life. So, for instance, there's another trigger which is a Vietnam veteran brother who died, and he has to relate to his collecting his bones somehow. So, beyond the confusion, what seems to surface is the memory in the blood thing, that some factors like the relatives, like all the triggering elements in that the fictional story presents, build up a new level of understanding who he is, but it's much less pigeonholes of identity, much more kind of a liminal space to define and redefine who they are. So I think I would pretty much end my presentation with a wrap up on these narratives. And sometimes I'm asked why I use the term mixed blood, because it's not PC anymore. Mixed blood, capital letter, one word is PC, and it's explained in first chapter of the book as regards to the Southwestern people, of those who actually identify with this term, Pueblo, Indian, and Euro-American, mix, more particularly German, Irish, Lebanese, and Spanish mix. So that does not refer to mulatto and other mixes. This is particularly a reference to Southwestern people of that sort. And I'd like to call again attention to how I reconnect this conference topic to reparatory justice and racial uncategorization, as well as exploring the limits of indigeneity as possible ways to have a conversation on this topic. And I leave you with the last slide on these identities, what actually entails, what is the pattern. The pattern is that it's a very difficult return to indigeneity, especially and only, especially if you haven't ever been connected to a particular tribe. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open to discussion on any of those. I have plenty of more slides on the psychology as well as the sociology of this literature, visual arts, everything, but